Every father's worst nightmare is hearing his child cry out in pain and fear. In 1882 Wyoming, that nightmare became reality for Virgil Thorne when his daughter's desperate scream echoed through the night. 10-year-old Sadie Mae, daughter of the territory's wealthiest cattleman, and his late wife from New Orleans, lived under harsh housekeepers while her father secured land. When cruel punishment crossed the line, her cry for Papa traveled farther than expected. Virgil returned that night with thunder in his boots, ready to face anyone who dared harm his girl. In a land divided by color and class, this became more than protection, it became justice. What happens when the most powerful man in the territory risks everything for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cold Rock. Wyoming stretched across the high plains like a weathered gravestone against the endless sky. The town had earned its name honestly, built on ground so hard that the first settlers claimed even their prayers bounced off it. But in the spring of 1882, as snow melted from the peaks and ran in silver streams through the valleys, there was something almost hopeful in the way. Morning light caught the windows of the general store and painted golden squares on the dusty main. Street Virgil Thorne had never been a man to put much stock in hope. At 49, his face carried the map of hard years, deep lines carved by wind and worry, grey threading through hair that had once been black as coal. His hands, broad and scarred from decades of honest work, told the story of a man who had built something from nothing. The Thorne Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, and Virgil's cattle bore his brand from the Powder River to the Colorado border. But it wasn't land or cattle that had shaped the deepest lines around his eyes. Those came from love and loss, and the weight of promises made to a dying woman. He could still see Marie as clearly as if she stood before him now, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and gentle humor. She had been everything Cold Rock was not, refined where it was rough, educated where it was ignorant, hopeful where it had grown cynical. Marie Dubois, daughter of a free man of color who had built a successful shipping business in New Orleans, had come west in 1870 with books in her trunk and dreams of teaching children who had never seen the inside of a proper schoolhouse. The town had not known what to make of her. A woman of color with fine clothes and finer manners, who spoke French and quoted poetry, who could discuss philosophy with the circuit judge and tend a wounded man with equal skill. Some whispered that she was too proud, too different. Others simply stared and said nothing at all. Virgil had fallen in love with her courage first, then her kindness, and finally with the way she laughed, like water over stones, clear and musical. When he asked her to marry him, half the town predicted disaster. The other half simply turned away, unwilling to watch what they were certain would end in heartbreak. They had been wrong. For 11 years, Marie had been the center of Virgil's world, the steady flame around which everything else turned. She had made their home a place where literature lived alongside livestock ledgers, where the sound of her piano drifted across the range on summer evenings, where love had grown strong enough to withstand the weight of other people's judgment. And then, one terrible winter, pneumonia had taken her. Virgil fingered the gold chain around his neck. Hidden beneath his shirt, Marie's wedding ring hung there, warm against his chest, a reminder of promises made and kept, of love that death couldn't diminish. He had sworn to her, as she lay dying, that their daughter would know she was cherished, would understand that she came from strength on both sides, would never doubt that she belonged in any world she chose to enter. Sadie Mae was 10 years old now, and in her, Virgil could see both her parents' finest qualities. She had Marie's quick intelligence and curious nature, her mother's love of books and learning. But she also had Virgil's stubborn streak, his refusal to back down when he knew he was right, and his deep sense of justice. She was beautiful in the way children are beautiful, all potential and bright eyes, but there was something else in her face, something that spoke of both innocence and wisdom beyond her years. Life had not been entirely kind to Sadie Mae Thorne. In a town where most children fell neatly into expected categories, she remained something of a puzzle. Her skin was the color of honey in sunlight, her hair a mass of dark curls that defied any attempt at taming. Some saw a sweet child who deserved protection. Others saw only an uncomfortable reminder that the world was changing in ways they didn't want to acknowledge. The Thorne house sat like a small palace on the hill overlooking Cold Rock. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with wide windows that caught the morning sun, and a wraparound porch where Marie used to sit with her embroidery and watch the sunset paint the mountains purple. Inside, the rooms were filled with reminders of Marie's refined taste: Persian rugs on polished wood floors, books lining the walls of Virgil's study, delicate china in the dining room that had traveled all the way from New Orleans. It was in this house that Sadie Mae spent her days while Virgil traveled on business. Under the watchful eye of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the housekeeper was a thin, sharp-featured woman of 60 who had come west after her husband died in the war. She ran the Thorne household with military precision, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every meal appeared on schedule. But there was something cold in her gray eyes when she looked at Sadie Mae, a tightness around her mouth that suggested disapproval held barely in check. "That child needs a firmer hand," she had told Virgil more than once. Her mother filled her head with too many fanciful ideas. She needs to understand her place in the world. Virgil had never asked what Mrs. Hartwell thought that place might be. Working alongside Mrs. Hartwell was Buck Morrison, a man of 45 who served as ranch foreman and general overseer when Virgil was away on business. Buck was competent enough with cattle and horses, but Virgil had noticed a change in him over the past year. A surly attitude, a tendency to question orders, and a way of looking at Sadie Mae that made Virgil's jaw clench with suppressed anger. Buck had grown up poor in Kansas, the son of a man who measured his worth by the darkness of other men's skin and the depth of their bank accounts. He resented working for a man who had married a woman of color, and he especially resented taking orders filtered through Mrs. Hartwell from a 10-year-old girl who, in his estimation, had gotten above herself. The tension in the house was something Sadie Mae felt but couldn't fully understand. She knew that Mrs. Hartwell's smiles never reached her eyes, that Buck looked right through her when she spoke to him, that the two adults spoke differently to her when her father was gone. But she was still young enough to believe that if she was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, things would somehow get better. On this particular morning in late April, as meadowlarks sang from the fence posts and the air carried the sweet scent of new grass, Virgil was 3 days' ride away in Cheyenne, negotiating the purchase of additional grazing rights. He had been gone for 2 weeks, and Sadie Mae missed him with an ache that seemed to live in her chest. She missed his deep laugh, his stories about the cattle drives of his youth, the way he listened to her read aloud from her mother's books as if her voice was music. In his absence, the house had grown quieter, colder. Mrs. Hartwell's rules seemed to multiply daily: no running in the hallways, no singing at breakfast, no touching anything in the parlor without permission. Buck had taken to eating his meals at the kitchen table instead of with the ranch hands, his presence filling the room with unspoken hostility. But Sadie Mae had learned to find joy in small things. She had her mother's books hidden away in her room where she could read by lamplight. She had her wooden horse, carved by her father's own hands, which galloped across imaginary plains in the privacy of her imagination. And she had her memories of her mother's voice, teaching her that kindness was strength, that intelligence was a gift to be shared, that love could overcome any obstacle if you held fast to it. She had no way of knowing that on this bright April morning, as she tried to be helpful in her father's absence, she was about to test the truth of her mother's teachings in ways no child should ever have to face. The morning started like any other in the Thorne house. Sadie Mae woke to the sound of Mrs. Hartwell's sharp footsteps in the hallway below, followed by the clatter of pots and pans as breakfast preparations began. She dressed quickly in her blue cotton dress, the one with tiny flowers that her mother had sewn by hand, and braided her hair as neatly as she could manage without help. Mrs. Hartwell was already setting the table when Sadie Mae entered the dining room, her movements precise and economical. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished mahogany surface, where her mother's best china gleamed like small treasures. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," Sadie Mae said quietly. As she had been taught, the housekeeper barely looked up. "Breakfast in 10 minutes. Don't dawdle." Buck Morrison sat at the far end of the table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup, his pale eyes fixed on something beyond the window. He didn't acknowledge Sadie Mae's presence, which had become his custom in recent weeks. She had learned not to expect pleasantries from him. As Mrs. Hartwell bustled back to the kitchen, Sadie Mae noticed that the sugar bowl was empty. Her father always took 2 spoonfuls in his coffee, and she had seen Mrs. Hartwell do the same. Perhaps if she filled it from the pantry, she could show that she was helpful, that she deserved to be treated with the same kindness Mrs. Hartwell showed the visiting ladies from town. The sugar was stored on a high shelf in the pantry, in a large ceramic container with a tight-fitting lid. Sadie Mae dragged a wooden stool across the floor and climbed up carefully, the way her father had taught her when reaching for things. She could almost hear his voice, "Slow and steady, little darling. Nothing's worth getting hurt over." She managed to lift down the heavy container without incident and scooped sugar into the delicate china bowl with its painted roses and gold rim. This particular sugar bowl had been her mother's pride, a wedding gift from Marie's grandmother in New Orleans, one of the few precious things that had made the journey west. Sadie Mae remembered her mother saying that it had survived a hurricane, a war, and 1,000 miles of rough roads, as if its beauty had made it invincible. She was carrying the bowl back to the dining room, walking as carefully as she could on the polished wooden floor, when disaster struck. Buck Morrison chose that exact moment to push back his chair and stand directly in her path. Startled, Sadie Mae tried to step aside too quickly. Her feet tangled in the hem of her dress, and she stumbled forward. The sugar bowl flew from her hands, arcing through the morning sunlight like a beautiful, doomed bird. Time seemed to slow as Sadie Mae watched it tumble through the air, knowing with terrible certainty what was about to happen, but powerless to prevent it. The bowl struck the floor with a sound like a gunshot, exploding into a dozen sharp pieces that scattered across the dining room like fallen stars. The silence that followed was deafening. Buck Morrison looked down at the destruction with something that might have been satisfaction. Sadie Mae dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the pieces, as if she could somehow put her mother's treasure back together through sheer force of will. "What have you done?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She stood in the doorway, her face white with fury, her gray eyes blazing. "You clumsy, careless child. That bowl was worth more than your father pays me in a month." "I'm sorry," Sadie Mae whispered, a piece of painted porcelain cutting into her palm as she tried to collect the fragments. "I was just trying to help. I didn't mean—" "Don't mean!" Mrs. Hartwell strode across the room and grabbed Sadie Mae by the arm, jerking her to her feet with enough force to make her cry out. "Your father spoils you, lets you think you can touch anything you please, go anywhere you want. Well, he's not here now, is he?" Buck Morrison watched from the corner, his arms crossed, making no move to intervene. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. "Please, Mrs. Hartwell, it was an accident." The slap came without warning, sharp and stinging across Sadie Mae's cheek. She staggered backward, her hand flying to her face, tears springing to her eyes more from shock than pain. "Accidents happen to careless children who don't know their place," Mrs. Hartwell hissed. "Since your father isn't here to teach you properly, I suppose that responsibility falls to me." She dragged Sadie Mae toward the kitchen, her grip tight enough to leave bruises on the child's thin arm. "Buck, bring me that switch from the pantry. Mrs. Hartwell, please." Sadie Mae's voice broke on the words. She had never been struck before, not once in her 10 years. Her father believed in discipline through conversation and consequence, her mother through gentle guidance and understanding. This raw fury was something foreign and terrifying. "Please what?" Mrs. Hartwell shoved her toward a wooden chair. "Please let you destroy more of your mother's things? Please let you run wild like some untrained animal?" "I think not." Buck returned with a thin branch, stripped of leaves and dried hard as stone. He handed it to Mrs. Hartwell with the same expression he might wear while passing a tool. "This is what happens to children who touch things that don't belong to them," Mrs. Hartwell said, raising the switch. "Maybe this will teach you to remember your place." The first blow landed across Sadie Mae's shoulders, sharp and burning through the thin cotton of her dress. She cried out, more in shock than pain, but Mrs. Hartwell was just getting started. "Your mother's gone," the housekeeper said, punctuating each word with another strike. "Your father's away more often than not. You're just a burden here, a responsibility no one wants." The switch rose and fell with methodical cruelty, each blow accompanied by words designed to wound more deeply than any physical pain. Sadie Mae tried to shield herself, but Mrs. Hartwell grabbed her wrists and held them, leaving her defenseless. "Look at you," the woman continued, breathing hard from the exertion. "Neither one thing nor the other. Your mother should have stayed where she belonged, married her own kind. Then maybe you wouldn't be such a constant reminder of things better left alone." It was then, as pain bloomed across her back and arms, as cruel words cut deeper than any switch ever could, that Sadie Mae found her voice. The cry that tore from her throat was primal, desperate, born of a child's absolute faith that somewhere in the world someone cared enough to answer. "Papa!" she screamed, her voice carrying through the house and out into the morning air. "Papa, they hurt me! Papa, please!" Mrs. Hartwell struck her again, harder. "Stop that screaming. No one can hear you and no one's coming." But Sadie Mae's cry had already traveled farther than the confines of the house, farther than Mrs. Hartwell could have imagined. It rode the wind across the plains, a child's desperate call for help that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. And somewhere, 3 days' hard ride away, a father's heart heard something that made him abandon his business and turn toward home with thunder in his boots. In the dining room, amid the scattered pieces of broken china, the morning sun continued to stream through the lace curtains, illuminating the destruction that had started with a simple desire to help and had become something much more terrible. The moment when a child learned that the world could be cruel to those it deemed different, and that sometimes even home wasn't safe. 3 days' ride north of Cold Rock, in a hotel room that smelled of tobacco and leather, Virgil Thorne sat across a polished table from Theodore Hartman, the territorial land commissioner. Between them lay maps, deeds, and contracts representing more acreage than most men would see in a lifetime. The deal they were negotiating would add another 8,000 acres to the Thorne Ranch, prime grazing land that would secure his daughter's future for generations to come. But Virgil's mind kept drifting to home. He opened his leather-bound business ledger, a thick book filled with meticulous records of cattle prices, land purchases, and ranch expenses, and found himself staring at a pressed flower Marie had placed there years ago. A wild rose from their wedding day, now brittle and brown, but still carrying the ghost of its original beauty. "Mr. Thorne?" Hartman's voice pulled him back to the present. "The terms I've outlined are more than fair. Your signature here, and the territory gains a valuable partnership, while you gain the security of—" "I understand the terms," Virgil said quietly, his weathered hands folding the ledger closed. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't name it. A restlessness in his chest, like a horse sensing a storm before the first clouds appeared. He'd learned to trust such feelings over the years. They had kept him alive through cattle wars and harsh winters, through the grief of losing Marie and the challenges of raising a mixed-race daughter in an unforgiving world. The hotel door burst open without ceremony, admitting a dust-covered messenger who looked as if he had ridden hard through the night. Virgil recognized him immediately, Tommy Garrett, one of the young men from Cold Rock, who sometimes carried urgent messages between ranches. Mr. Thorne, Tommy gasped, his hat clutched in trembling hands. I've been riding straight through since yesterday. There's been trouble at your place? Virgil was on his feet before the words had fully settled, every instinct screaming danger. What kind of trouble? It's Miss Sadie Mae, sir. Tommy swallowed hard, his young face pale with exhaustion and distress. Mrs. Crawford from the general store. She heard the child screaming yesterday morning. Screaming for you, sir. Just crying out Papa like her heart was breaking. The world seemed to tilt around Virgil. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white against the polished wood. Is she hurt? Don't rightly know the details, sir. Mrs. Crawford said she went over to check, but Mrs. Hartwell wouldn't let her see Miss Sadie Mae. Said it was a private family matter. But the whole town heard the screaming, Mr. Thorne. That little girl was calling for you like she was in terrible pain. Commissioner Hartman cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we could postpone these negotiations until there will be no negotiation, Virgil said, his voice carrying the finality of winter wind. He was already moving, gathering his papers, his mind calculating distances and travel time. Tommy, how long ago? 26 hours, sir. I rode straight through when Mrs. Crawford asked me to find you. Virgil's jaw set in a line that men who knew him had learned to respect. In 20 years of building his empire, he had earned a reputation as a fair but implacable man. When crossed, he became something altogether more dangerous, a force of nature guided by an unshakable moral code. Commissioner Hartman, this meeting is finished. He folded the contracts and slipped them into his coat pocket without signing them. I'll be in touch when my family matters are settled. But Mr. Thorne, these land rights won't wait. The territorial legislature meets next month and... Virgil turned, and something in his eyes made the older man's words die in his throat. My daughter called for me. Nothing else matters until I answer that call. Within 10 minutes, Virgil had settled his hotel bill and was saddling his horse in the stable behind the building. Storm was a big bay gelding, 16 hands of muscle and intelligence, bred for endurance rather than speed. Virgil had ridden him through blizzards and across desert country, and the horse had never failed him. As he secured his bedroll and supplies, memories flooded through him, promises made to a dying woman, vows spoken in a voice rough with grief. "Promise me," Marie had whispered, her dark eyes bright with fever, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll protect her. The world will try to make her feel like she doesn't belong anywhere, but you'll show her she belongs everywhere." "Promise me, Virgil," he had promised. And in the 3 years since Marie's death, he had done everything in his power to keep that promise. He had hired Mrs. Hartwell because she came recommended by the pastor's wife, because she seemed competent and reliable. He had kept Buck Morrison on as foreman because the man knew cattle and horses, because Virgil needed someone to run the ranch during his frequent business trips. But he had also noticed things, small things that had been easy to dismiss when viewed individually, but now formed a pattern that made his blood run cold. The way Mrs. Hartwell's voice changed when she spoke about Sadie Mae, the way Buck avoided looking at the child directly, the gradual cooling of the house's atmosphere whenever Virgil was away for more than a few days. He swung into the saddle, and Storm responded to the subtle pressure of his knees, moving from a walk to a trot, to a ground-eating lope that would carry them home. 26 hours. His daughter had called for him 26 hours ago, and he hadn't been there to answer. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest. Every business trip, every land deal, every hour spent building an empire for her future. It all felt hollow now. What good were thousands of acres and countless cattle if he failed in the most basic duty of fatherhood? What value did all his wealth have if the one person who mattered most was crying out in pain while he negotiated contracts hundreds of miles away? The landscape blurred past as Storm settled into the steady rhythm that would carry them through the long day and into the night. Virgil's mind raced ahead, planning, calculating, preparing for whatever he might find when he reached home. If anyone had laid a hand on his daughter, if anyone had caused her to scream for him in desperate need, They would answer for it. He remembered Marie's gentle voice, her constant insistence that violence was never the first solution, that understanding and patience could accomplish more than anger. But Marie had never been forced to ride through the night to answer her child's cry for help. The sun climbed toward noon, then began its descent toward the western horizon. Storm's hooves beat out a steady rhythm on the packed earth. Home, home, home. And with each mile, Virgil Thorne felt the businessman falling away, replaced by something more primal, more dangerous, a father riding to war. Virgil arrived at the ranch as the last light was fading from the western sky, Storm's flanks heaving from the hard ride. The house sat on its hill, like a beacon in the gathering darkness, windows glowing with lamplight that should have felt welcoming but instead seemed cold and distant. He had pushed both himself and his horse mercilessly, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Driven by a father's instinct that time was more precious than rest, he approached quietly, leaving Storm at the hitching post near the barn rather than announcing his arrival. Something about the silence of the place troubled him. No sounds from the kitchen, where Mrs. Hartwell should have been preparing the evening meal, no laughter or conversation drifting from the house. Even the ranch hands seemed to have made themselves scarce, though he could see light in the bunkhouse windows across the yard. The front door stood unlocked, as it always did. Virgil had never seen the need for locks in a country where a man's reputation was his strongest protection. But now he entered his own home like a stranger, moving through the familiar rooms with the careful attention of someone expecting trouble. He found Sadie Mae in her bedroom, curled on her side beneath her mother's quilt, so still that for a terrible moment he thought she might be seriously injured. But as he approached, he could see the steady rise and fall of her breathing, and relief flooded through him like warm water. "Sadie Mae," he whispered, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. "Little darling, Papa's home." Her eyes opened immediately, as if she had been waiting for his voice, even in sleep. When she saw him, her face crumpled with relief and something deeper, a wounded trust that made his chest tighten with rage. "Papa," she breathed, struggling to sit up. He could see the careful way she moved, favoring her left side, and when she turned toward the lamplight, he saw the fading bruise on her cheek where a hand had struck her. "Who did this to you?" The words came out rougher than he intended, and he forced himself to speak more gently. "Tell me what happened, sweetheart." The story came out in halting phrases, interrupted by tears that she tried bravely to hold back. She told him about the sugar bowl, about trying to be helpful, about the accident that had seemed so small until Mrs. Hartwell's fury had made it enormous. She told him about the switch and the cruel words, about being called a burden and a reminder of things better left alone. With each word, Virgil felt his anger building like pressure in a boiler. But he kept his voice calm, his hands gentle as he smoothed her dark curls away from her face. This was not the time for his rage. This was the time to be exactly what she needed. The father who had come when she called. "Show me," he said quietly. Sadie Mae hesitated, then carefully lifted the back of her nightgown. Even in the soft lamplight, Virgil could see the red welts across her shoulders and back, some still raised, others already fading to purple bruises. His hands shook as he lowered the fabric and gathered her into his arms, holding her as carefully as he would hold something made of spun glass. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered against his chest. "I tried to be good. I just wanted to help." "You have nothing to be sorry for," he told her, his voice fierce with conviction. "Nothing at all. You are good, Sadie Mae. You are the best thing in my life, and anyone who hurts you answers to me." He held her until her breathing steadied, and some of the tension left her small body. Then he tucked her back beneath the quilt and kissed her forehead, the way Marie used to do when nightmares came calling. "Where is Mrs. Hartwell?" he asked. "In her room, I think. She said I was to stay in here until further notice. Buck went to town after it happened." Virgil nodded, filing away that information. "I want you to rest now. Tomorrow we'll talk about making some changes around here. But tonight you're safe. Papa's home, and I'm not going anywhere. He waited until her eyes closed and her breathing deepened before he rose from the bed. In his coat pocket, he carried Sadie's composition book, a leather-bound journal where she wrote her thoughts and practiced her lessons. He had found it earlier among her things, and reading her careful handwriting had only deepened his fury. The entries from recent weeks painted a picture of a child trying desperately to earn approval from adults who saw her as an inconvenience at best. "I will be good today," read one entry. "I will not touch anything in the parlor. I will speak only when spoken to. Maybe then Mrs. Hartwell will smile at me the way she smiles at the ladies from town." Another entry, dated just a week ago. "Mama used to say that kindness makes people beautiful. I wonder if I am not kind enough because Mrs. Hartwell does not think I am beautiful. Buck looks right through me like I am made of air. Maybe if I try harder, they will see me the way Papa sees me." The composition book now felt like evidence in his hands, proof of systematic cruelty designed to break a child's spirit. His daughter, who had inherited Marie's intelligence and curiosity, who could read poetry in French and calculate cattle prices in her head, had been reduced to begging for basic human kindness in her own home. Virgil made his way downstairs, his boots silent on the polished wood floors. The house felt different now, contaminated by knowledge of what had happened within its walls. He could see broken china scattered beneath the dining room table, carelessly swept into a corner rather than properly cleaned up. Mrs. Hartwell's contempt was evident even in her housekeeping. He found Marie's Bible in his study, the leather cover worn smooth by loving hands. Inside, pressed between the pages like precious jewels, were flowers from their courtship and early marriage, wildflowers picked on long rides across the range, cultivated roses from the garden Marie had planted with such hope. Each bloom told a story of love that had flourished despite the world's disapproval. Virgil held the Bible for a long moment, drawing strength from the memory of his wife's unwavering faith in the power of love to overcome hatred. Marie had believed that patience and understanding could change hearts, that leading by example was more powerful than any show of force. But Marie had never seen their daughter beaten for the crime of trying to help. She had never watched Sadie Mae flinch away from a raised hand or heard her apologize for existing. Some things, Virgil was beginning to understand, required more than patience to correct. Dawn came slowly to the Wyoming high plains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Virgil of better mornings when Marie would stand at their bedroom window, watching the sun rise over their domain. But this morning brought no peace, only the grim clarity that came with a night spent planning justice. Virgil had not slept. Instead, he had sat in his study, Marie's Bible open before him, thinking about the delicate balance between righteousness and revenge. The pressed flowers between the pages seemed to whisper of his wife's gentle nature, her belief that every person carried the potential for goodness if approached with patience and understanding, but the red welts on his daughter's back spoke a different language entirely. He was in the kitchen when Mrs. Hartwell came downstairs, her grey hair pinned with military precision, her starched dress crisp as fresh snow. She stopped short when she saw him, her pale eyes widening in surprise that she quickly tried to mask with professional composure. "Mr. Thorne," she said, smoothing her skirts, "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. How did your business conclude in Cheyenne?" "My business concluded the moment I learned my daughter was calling for me in pain," Virgil replied quietly. He stood with his back to the window, the morning light throwing his shadow across the kitchen floor like a dark omen. "I believe you and I need to have a conversation, Mrs. Hartwell." She lifted her chin, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her apron. "If this is about the unfortunate incident with the sugar bowl, I can explain." "The unfortunate incident," Virgil repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "Is that what we're calling it when a grown woman beats a 10-year-old child with a switch?" Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed, but her voice remained steady. "That child broke a valuable piece of your late wife's china through pure carelessness. She needed to learn that actions have consequences. Show me your hands." The request caught her off guard. "I beg your pardon. "Your hands, Mrs. Hartwell. Show them to me." Reluctantly, she extended her hands, palms up. Virgil could see the soft skin of someone who had spent years in comfortable employment, with only the faint calluses that came from light household work. "These are not the hands of someone who understands hard labor," he observed. "These are not the hands of someone who has ever gone without a meal or slept in the cold. Yet you saw fit to use these hands to strike my daughter for an accident. Mr. Thorne, you weren't here. You don't understand how willful she's become, I understand that my daughter has been living in fear in her own home." His voice remained level, but there was iron beneath the calm. "I understand that the child who used to run to greet me when I returned from trips now flinches when adults raise their voices. I understand that somewhere in the past months the light went out of her eyes." Mrs. Hartwell drew herself up to her full height, her jaw set in stubborn lines. "Someone has to teach her discipline." Her mother filled her head with fancy ideas, made her think she was better than she is. "Someone has to show her reality." The silence that followed was profound enough that the ticking of the kitchen clock sounded like gunshots. Virgil stepped closer, and Mrs. Hartwell involuntarily took a step backward. "And what reality would that be, Mrs. Hartwell?" he asked softly. "The reality that a 10-year-old child should be grateful for scraps of basic human kindness? The reality that she should apologize for existing? The reality that her mixed blood makes her less deserving of love? I never said—" "You said she was a burden. You told her that her mother should have married her own kind." My daughter remembered every word, Mrs. Hartwell. She wrote them down in her composition book, trying to understand why the adults in her life treated her with such cruelty. The color drained from the housekeeper's face. She had not known about the journal, had not realized that her casual cruelties were being recorded in a child's careful handwriting. "I was trying to prepare her for the world," she said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "People talk, Mr. Thorne. They say things about children like her. I thought if she understood her place—" "Her place," Virgil interrupted, "is as my daughter. Her place is as the heir to everything I've built. Her place is wherever she chooses to make it, because she has the intelligence, the character, and the love to succeed anywhere." He moved to the kitchen window and looked out at the land that stretched to the horizon. His land, built through years of hard work and careful planning. When he turned back, his expression was implacable. "Pack your things, Mrs. Hartwell. You have until noon to be gone from my property." She stared at him in shock. "You can't be serious. I've been nothing but loyal to this household. I've maintained your home, managed your affairs. You beat my daughter with a switch and told her she was unwanted. You made her feel like a stranger in her own home. There is no loyalty in that, Mrs. Hartwell. There is only cruelty dressed up in the language of duty. Where am I supposed to go? I have no family, no other prospects. That is not my concern." Virgil's tone carried the finality of winter wind. "You had choices every day about how to treat a child in your care. You chose cruelty over kindness, judgment over understanding. Now you live with the consequences of those choices." Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally cracked. "This is about more than discipline, isn't it? This is about her blood, about what people think when they see her. You can protect her here in your house on your land, but what happens when she goes into town? What happens when she grows up and tries to make her way in a world that won't accept her?" Virgil was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The world will accept her because I will teach her to demand acceptance through excellence. She will be so intelligent, so capable, so undeniably worthy that no one will dare question her place. And if they do question it, they will answer to me." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at the woman who had been entrusted with his most precious treasure and had chosen to wound her instead of protect her. Noon. "Mrs. Hartwell, be gone by noon." By mid-morning, word of Mrs. Hartwell's dismissal had spread through Cold Rock like wildfire through dry grass. Virgil could see the evidence in the way conversations stopped when he rode into town, in the sideways glances and whispered exchanges between storekeepers and their customers. The power of his name and fortune had always commanded respect, But now he sensed something different in the air, a current of tension that spoke of divided loyalties and uncomfortable truths. He had business to conduct beyond the reckoning with his household staff. Sadie Mae would need new arrangements for her care and education, and he intended to make changes that would serve notice to anyone who might question his daughter's place in the community. But first, he needed to understand exactly what had been happening in his absence. Mrs. Ida Crawford, who ran the general store with her husband, was the first to approach him directly. A woman of 50 with kind eyes and graying brown hair, she had known Marie and had always treated Sadie Mae with genuine warmth. "Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, drawing him aside as he examined the land deed documents he'd brought from Cheyenne. "I'm glad you're back. That poor child, we heard her crying out yesterday morning. It near broke my heart. You heard her from here?" The store was a good quarter-mile from his house, clear as a bell. Sound carries strange on the wind sometimes, especially when it's a child in distress. Mrs. Crawford glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I went over to check, but Mrs. Hartwell wouldn't let me see her. Said it was family business and none of my concern." Virgil filed this information away, another piece of evidence in the pattern he was beginning to understand. "Did anyone else hear?" "Half the town, I'd reckon. But most folks—" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Most folks figured it wasn't their place to interfere. You know how people can be about getting involved in other families' affairs." What she didn't say, but Virgil heard anyway, was that some people might have been less inclined to intervene for a child of mixed heritage than they would have been for others. The thought settled in his stomach like a cold stone. "Mrs. Crawford, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. How has my daughter been treated in town when I'm away?" The older woman's face creased with sympathy and something that might have been shame. "She's a sweet child, Mr. Thorne, always polite, always well-behaved. But there are some who—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are some who think children like her need to understand their place early. And what place would that be? Not the place you've given her, that's certain. Some folks think you've made her too proud, given her ideas above her station." Mrs. Crawford's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's been talk about sending her east, to one of those schools for colored children. Keep her with her own kind." The words hit Virgil like a physical blow. His own kind. As if Sadie Mae's kind wasn't simply human, simply his daughter, simply a child who deserved love and protection and opportunity. Who has been doing this talking? Before Mrs. Crawford could answer, the store door opened with enough force to rattle the glass. Buck Morrison stood in the doorway, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his weathered face set in hard lines. He had clearly been drinking, though it was barely past noon. "So the king has returned to his castle," Buck said, his words slightly slurred but his intent crystal clear. "Come back to coddle that half-breed brat some more." The store fell silent. Mrs. Crawford gasped, and her husband emerged from behind the counter, his hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun he kept for emergencies. But Virgil simply turned to face his former foreman, his expression calm as deep water. "You're drunk. Buck, go home and sleep it off. I'm drunk, but I'm not wrong." Buck stepped further into the store, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "That girl is going to bring nothing but trouble to this town. Bad enough her mother came here putting on airs, acting like she belonged with decent white folk. But at least she had the grace to die before she could do too much damage." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Virgil felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest, a killing calm that he hadn't experienced since his younger, harder days. "What did you just say about my wife?" Buck's liquor-fueled courage made him bold. "I said she got above herself, just like that girl is doing now. Difference is, Marie knew how to stay in her place most of the time. But you're raising that child to think she's good as anyone, and that's going to cause problems for everybody. The only problem I see," Virgil said quietly, "is a drunk man speaking disrespectfully about my family in public. I suggest you remedy that situation immediately." But Buck was past the point of rational conversation. "You want to know what really happened yesterday? That girl got exactly what she deserved. Mrs. Hartwell was trying to teach her some manners, some respect. But you can't civilize what's wild in the blood." The store was so quiet that the sound of Virgil's boots on the wooden floor seemed like thunder. He walked slowly toward Buck, and something in his manner made the foreman's drunken bravado begin to falter. "You were there," Virgil said, "and it wasn't a question. You watched a woman beat my 10-year-old daughter with a switch, and you did nothing to stop it." Buck's jaw jutted forward defiantly. "Wasn't my place to interfere. Besides, maybe some hard lessons will keep her from getting ideas that'll only cause trouble later." Virgil stopped directly in front of Buck, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough to see the mix of fear and hatred in the man's eyes. "Pack your things and get off my land," he said with deadly quiet. "You have until sunset. You can't fire me. I know this ranch better than anyone. I can, and I have. And Buck," Virgil's voice dropped even lower, "if I ever see you near my daughter again, if I ever hear of you speaking about my family in public again, we'll have a conversation that won't end with words." Buck's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. "This ain't over, Thorne. You think your money makes you better than everybody else, but there are plenty of folks in this town who know what that girl really is. You can't protect her forever." He pushed past Virgil and stalked out of the store, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken tensions and uncomfortable truths. Virgil stood in the doorway, watching his former employee mount his horse and ride toward the ranch, knowing that this confrontation was only the beginning of something larger and more dangerous than he had initially understood. Virgil returned to the ranch with his mind churning over Buck's parting words and the uncomfortable truths they revealed about his community's attitudes. But as he rode up the familiar path to his house, he noticed something that made him rein in storm and study the landscape with a cattleman's practiced eye. The western pasture looked sparse, not drought-sparse or winter-sparse, but deliberately thinned, as if someone had been selectively removing the finest cattle over a period of months. He had been so focused on his daughter's immediate crisis that he hadn't taken time to assess his property with the attention it deserved. Now, with suspicion growing in his mind like a poisonous plant, he turned storm toward the barn where he kept his ranch records. Every head of cattle was documented in meticulous detail: breeding lines, purchase dates, market values, and grazing assignments. If someone had been tampering with his herd, the numbers would tell the story. The barn was quiet in the afternoon heat, dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that filtered through the high windows. Virgil pulled down the ledger where his foreman was supposed to record daily cattle counts and began comparing the entries to his own master records. What he found made his blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, Buck Morrison had been reporting cattle losses to wolves and disease at a rate that should have been catastrophic. According to the foreman's records, Virgil had lost nearly 200 head to various misfortunes, a financial blow that would have been impossible to hide during normal times. But these weren't normal times. Virgil's extended absences on land deals had given Buck unprecedented freedom to manage the ranch without oversight. And Mrs. Hartwell, as household manager, had access to the account books where such losses would be recorded for tax purposes. Virgil pulled out additional ledgers, cross-referencing bank deposits with reported cattle sales, comparing feed purchases with herd sizes, tracking the complex web of numbers that told the real story of his ranch's operations. The pattern that emerged was as clear as it was infuriating. Buck Morrison had been systematically stealing cattle and selling them to buyers in distant markets, reporting the thefts as natural losses. Mrs. Hartwell had been falsifying the household accounts to cover the missing revenue, skimming money for herself while creating a paper trail that would have eventually bankrupted the ranch if allowed to continue. But the most damning discovery came in a stack of correspondence hidden behind other papers in Buck's desk. Letters written in Mrs. Hartwell's precise handwriting, addressed to a cattle buyer in Denver, discussing shipments and prices and the need for discretion. Letters that made it clear this wasn't opportunistic theft, but a carefully planned operation designed to strip Virgil of his wealth over time. One letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, contained a passage that made Virgil's hands shake with rage. The boss is away more often now, dealing with those land purchases. The girl is becoming a problem, too curious, too observant. We may need to take stronger measures to keep her occupied and out of our business. A firm hand now could prevent complications later. Suddenly, Sadie Mae's punishment took on an entirely different character. The broken sugar bowl had been inconvenient timing, but Mrs. Hartwell's brutal response had served multiple purposes. It had terrorized his daughter into submission, discouraged her natural curiosity about ranch operations, and sent a message that questioning adult authority would result in severe consequences. They had beaten his child not just from prejudice and cruelty, but as part of a calculated effort to steal his life's work. Virgil sat in the barn's dim light, surrounded by evidence of betrayal so complete it took his breath away. These people hadn't just abused his hospitality and violated his trust. They had turned his own home into a weapon against his daughter, using fear and violence to protect their criminal enterprise. The hidden letters revealed the full scope of their operation. Buck had been selling cattle to a network of buyers who asked no questions about brands or bills of sale. Mrs. Hartwell had been embezzling household funds for over a year, taking small amounts regularly while creating false entries for legitimate expenses. Together, they had stolen enough to buy their own ranch somewhere far from Wyoming, where they could start fresh with money stolen from a man who had trusted them with everything he valued. But their plan had one fatal flaw. They hadn't counted on Sadie Mae's desperate cry for help, reaching her father's ears so quickly. As Virgil studied the correspondence, he began to understand the real timeline of events. Buck and Mrs. Hartwell had been planning their final theft for weeks, waiting for Virgil to be away long enough to complete the largest cattle sale yet. The housekeeper's savage punishment of Sadie Mae hadn't been about discipline. It had been about fear that the child might report something she had seen or overheard. A noise outside made him look up sharply. Through the barn door, he could see Buck Morrison loading his belongings into a wagon, moving with the urgency of a man who knew his time was running short. But instead of the defeated slump of someone who had been fired, Buck's posture suggested purpose, determination, and something that might have been satisfaction. Virgil quietly made his way to a position where he could observe without being seen. Buck wasn't packing with the random haste of someone leaving in disgrace. He was selecting specific items, loading them carefully, like a man preparing for a planned departure rather than an unexpected dismissal. The truth hit Virgil like a physical blow. Buck Morrison had never expected to remain on the ranch much longer. The confrontation in town, the drunken insults, the apparent desperation, it had all been theater, designed to make his dismissal seem like the inevitable result of his behavior rather than the discovery of his crimes. Buck finished loading the wagon and climbed onto the driver's seat. But instead of heading toward town as a dismissed employee would, he turned the wagon toward the back trails that led to the rail station 20 miles north. The same trails that cattle thieves would use to move stolen herds without being seen from the main road. Mrs. Hartwell appeared from the house, carrying a carpet bag and a strongbox that Virgil recognized as his own, the one where he kept emergency cash for ranch operations. She moved with the efficiency of someone executing a long-practiced plan, not the flustered rush of someone leaving in disgrace. As the wagon disappeared into the gathering dusk, Virgil remained hidden in the barn, his mind working through the implications of what he had discovered. Buck and Mrs. Hartwell weren't fleeing in panic. They were executing the final phase of their theft, taking with them not just his cattle and money, but the satisfaction of having inflicted lasting damage on the man who had trusted them. They had miscalculated in only one respect. They had assumed that brutally punishing his daughter would be forgotten once their theft was discovered, that Sadie Mae's suffering would pale in comparison to his financial losses. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. Dawn brought clarity and cold determination to the Thorne Ranch. Virgil had spent the night in his study, Not sleeping, but planning, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and maps showing the routes Buck Morrison would most likely take to reach the railroad. His Colt Peacemaker lay on the desk beside the ledgers and letters, its weight both comforting and sobering, a reminder of solutions that might be necessary but weren't yet inevitable. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted his planning. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Tom Brennan approaching, his weathered face grave with the kind of expression that comes from years of delivering bad news. Behind him rode two men Virgil recognized from town, honest ranchers who had faced their own struggles with cattle theft in recent months. "Virgil," Brennan said as he entered the study, his hat in his hands. "Heard there was trouble here. Came as soon as I could get away from town." "More trouble than I initially realized, Tom." Virgil gestured to the evidence spread across his desk. "Take a look at this and tell me what you think." The sheriff studied the ledgers and correspondence with the careful attention of a man who had seen too many schemes to be easily surprised. But as the full scope of the theft became clear, his expression hardened into something that spoke of personal offense at the audacity of the crime. "Jesus, Virgil, they've been bleeding you dry for months. How much do you figure they took?" "Near $15,000 in cattle, probably another $3,000 in cash and household accounts." Virgil's voice was steady, but the numbers represented years of careful planning and hard work. "Enough to set them up anywhere they wanted to start fresh. And they beat your little girl to keep her quiet while they finished the job." Sheriff Brennan's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. "That crosses a line that can't be uncrossed." One of the other men, Pete Garrison, cleared his throat. "Virgil, I think we may have seen some of your cattle. Week and a half ago, Buck Morrison came through my place with about 30 head, said you were moving them to new grazing. Didn't think anything of it at the time, but now, which direction were they headed?" "North, toward the rail junction. But here's the thing, I was in town yesterday when Buck was causing that scene at Crawford's store. After he left, I got to thinking about how convenient it all seemed. Almost like he wanted to make sure everyone saw him getting fired." Virgil nodded, his suspicions confirmed. He needed witnesses to his dismissal, so no one would connect him to cattle that might still be missing. Make it look like he left in disgrace instead of according to plan. Sheriff Brennan was studying a map of the territory, marking likely routes with his finger. "If they're heading for the railroad at Millerville, they've got maybe a day's head start with a wagon. But that's assuming they're trying to make it look like a normal departure." "If they're in a hurry now, they're not in a hurry," Virgil interrupted. "That's what makes them dangerous. This whole thing has been planned too carefully for them to panic now. They'll stick to back trails, avoid main roads, probably have buyers already lined up for the cattle." The third man, Dave Miller, had been quiet until now, but his face showed the kind of anger that comes from personal experience. "We've all lost cattle this year. What if it wasn't just bad luck? What if Buck was working with other folks, setting up thefts across multiple ranches?" The possibility hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Virgil had been focused on his own losses. But if Buck Morrison had been operating a larger conspiracy, the implications reached far beyond one man's revenge. "There's only one way to find out," Sheriff Brennan said, reaching for his hat. "We need to catch them before they reach that railroad. Once they're on a train with stolen money, they could disappear forever." But Virgil was thinking deeper than simple pursuit. Justice for his financial losses was important, but it wasn't the driving force behind the cold anger in his chest. These people had tortured his daughter as part of their plan, had made her suffer to protect their crime. That required a reckoning that went beyond recovering stolen cattle. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." Virgil met the sheriff's eyes directly. "If we catch them, if we recover the evidence, will they face real consequences? Or will they get a slap on the wrist and a suggestion to leave the territory?" Brennan understood the subtext immediately. In the land where cattle theft could still mean a rope and a tall tree, the question of official versus frontier justice remained uncomfortably relevant. "The law will handle this, Virgil. I give you my word on that. But I also understand that some crimes cut deeper than money, and some victims deserve to see their tormentors answer for everything they did." As if summoned by the conversation, Sadie Mae appeared in the doorway, dressed in her blue dress with the tiny flowers, her dark curls neatly braided. The bruise on her cheek had faded to yellow-green, and she moved with less stiffness than the night before. But Virgil could still see the careful way she held herself, the wariness in her eyes when she looked at the group of armed men in her father's study. "Papa, Mrs. Crawford is here. She brought fresh bread and asked if she could see me." The simple request carried weight beyond its words. In offering to visit, Mrs. Crawford was making a statement about where her loyalties lay, showing the community that she stood with the Thorne family regardless of what others might think. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell her she's always welcome here." As Sadie Mae turned to go, Virgil called her back. "Sadie Mae, I want you to know that the people who hurt you are going to face consequences for what they did. Not just for taking our money, but for hurting you." She nodded solemnly, her dark eyes showing an understanding that no 10-year-old should need to possess. "Are you going after them, Papa?" "Yes, I am. But I'm going to do it the right way, with the sheriff and the law. Your mother always taught us that justice should be measured and fair, even when we're angry. Mama used to say that being better than bad people means acting better than they do." Sadie Mae's voice was quiet but steady. "She said that's how you change hearts." Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat softly. "Smart woman your mother was. And she raised a smart daughter." After Sadie Mae left to greet Mrs. Crawford, the men returned to their planning with renewed purpose. The evidence was clear, the trail was fresh, and the cause was just. But Virgil also understood that this pursuit would determine more than the fate of two thieves. It would establish how the community treated crimes against his family, and by extension, how they viewed his daughter's place in their world. "Gentlemen," he said, checking the loads in his Colt Peacemaker before holstering it, "we have work to do. But remember, this isn't about vengeance. This is about justice, and justice demands that we be better than the people we're pursuing." Pete Garrison nodded approvingly. "Your wife would be proud of that sentiment, Virgil." "My wife would be proud if we bring these criminals back alive to face proper trial," Virgil replied. But she would also understand that some actions require consequences serious enough to prevent repetition. They rode out within the hour, 4 men with a clear purpose and the law on their side. Behind them, the Thorne ranch settled into an unusual quiet, with Mrs. Crawford tending to Sadie Mae and the other ranch hands, maintaining their routines under the watchful eye of Pete Garrison's eldest son, who had volunteered to stay behind as protection. The trail north was clear enough for experienced trackers to follow, wagon ruts in the soft earth, horse droppings that told the story of livestock being moved quickly but not carelessly, and the occasional broken branch or disturbed ground that marked the passage of people trying to avoid main roads. But as they rode deeper into the high country, following sign that grew fresher with each mile, Virgil found himself thinking less about the mechanics of pursuit and more about the larger questions his daughter had raised. How do you change hearts? How do you be better than bad people while still ensuring they face meaningful consequences? The answer, he was beginning to understand, lay not in the outcome of this chase, but in how it was conducted, with precision instead of passion, with justice instead of revenge, and with the unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. They found Buck Morrison's camp in a sheltered valley 15 miles north of the ranch, where a creek ran clear and cold between stands of aspen trees. The wagon sat beneath the trees like a loaded promise, covered with canvas to hide its contents from casual observation. Smoke rose from a carefully banked fire, and Virgil could see the stolen cattle grazing peacefully in the meadow beyond. His cattle, bearing his brand, worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. Sheriff Brennan raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. They dismounted quietly, leaving their horses tied to trees at the valley's rim, where they wouldn't be seen or heard. The approach would need to be careful, Buck Morrison was armed and had already shown he was willing to cross lines most men wouldn't consider. "There," Dave Miller whispered, pointing toward a stand of willows near the creek. "Two people by the water." Through the trees, Virgil could make out Mrs. Hartwell's grey dress and Buck's familiar silhouette. They were standing close together, and even from a distance, their posture suggested an intimacy that went beyond simple criminal partnership. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. This hadn't been just about money. It had been about two people planning a future together, built on the ruins of the family that had trusted them. Sheriff Brennan checked his rifle and looked at each man in turn. "Remember, we want them alive to face trial. But if they resist, they'll resist," Virgil said quietly. "Buck's got too much pride to surrender quietly, and Mrs. Hartwell has too much at stake. But we do this by the book, Tom. My daughter needs to see that justice works the way it's supposed to." They spread out in a careful line, using the trees for cover as they worked their way down into the valley. The stolen cattle continued grazing peacefully, unaware that their presence was about to become evidence in a case that would reshape how Cold Rock understood crime and punishment. Virgil found himself thinking about Sadie Mae as he moved through the aspens, remembering her words about being better than bad people. His cold peacemaker felt heavy on his hip, a reminder of solutions that might become necessary but weren't yet inevitable. Everything depended on the next few minutes, whether justice could be achieved through law and reason, or whether the frontier would claim another victory over civilization. Buck Morrison spotted them first, his head snapping up like a deer sensing wolves. For a moment, the valley held its breath, predator and prey measuring each other across 30 yards of open ground. Then Buck's hand moved toward his gun, and the careful balance of the moment shattered. "Buck Morrison, you're under arrest for cattle theft and embezzlement." Sheriff Brennan's voice carried the authority of law and the promise of consequence. "Step away from your weapon and put your hands in the air." Instead of complying, Buck grabbed Mrs. Hartwell's arm and pulled her behind the wagon, using the stolen goods as cover while he reached for his rifle.
"Stay back, Brennan."
"This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when citizens of my territory are robbed and their children are beaten." The sheriff's voice remained steady, professional. "This is your last chance to surrender peacefully." Mrs. Hartwell's face appeared around the edge of the wagon, pale with fear but defiant. "Mr. Thorne, you don't understand what you're doing. We were leaving anyway, there's no need for this. You were leaving with my cattle, my money, and the satisfaction of having tortured my daughter." Virgil stepped into the open, his hands visible but ready. "That makes it very much my business." Buck's rifle barrel appeared over the wagon's edge, pointing directly at Virgil's chest. "You always thought you were better than everyone else, Thorne. Marrying that colored woman, acting like your money made you special. Well, your money's going to buy me and Eleanor a new life far away from here." "Eleanor?" Virgil looked at Mrs. Hartwell with new understanding. "How long have you two been planning this together?" The housekeeper's composure cracked slightly. "Long enough to know that girl of yours would never fit in anywhere that matters. We did you a favor, trying to teach her reality. The reality," Sheriff Brennan called out, "is that you're both under arrest. Put down your weapons and step out from behind that wagon." Buck's answer came in the form of a rifle shot that splintered the aspen bark inches from the sheriff's head. The sound echoed off the valley walls like thunder, and the careful negotiations dissolved into the harsh mathematics of survival. "Take cover," Virgil shouted, diving behind a fallen log as Buck worked the action of his rifle. The stolen cattle scattered in panic, their hoofbeats drumming against the earth as they sought safety in the higher meadows. Mrs. Hartwell screamed. Whether in fear or rage, it was impossible to tell. Another shot cracked across the valley, and Dave Mueller grunted as splinters from a tree trunk stung his face. The battle for justice had begun. The gun battle was brief but decisive. Buck Morrison had chosen his position poorly. The wagon that concealed him and Mrs. Hartwell also trapped them, limiting their options for movement or escape. Sheriff Brennan and his posse had the advantage of high ground and multiple angles of approach, but more importantly, they had the patience that comes from fighting for justice rather than personal gain. Virgil worked his way around the left flank, while Pete Garrison covered him with steady rifle fire. The stolen cattle had fled to safety, leaving the valley floor open and exposed. Buck's shots were becoming more desperate, less accurate, as the reality of his situation became clear. "Buck!" Virgil called from behind a large boulder. "This doesn't have to end with anyone dying. Throw down your rifle and we'll take you in alive." The answer came as another wild shot that went high and wide. Mrs. Hartwell was crying now, her sobs carrying clearly across the water. "Please, Buck. They're right, we can't win this." "Shut up, Eleanor. I'm not going to hang for some cattle." "You won't hang for cattle theft," Sheriff Brennan shouted back. "But if you kill a lawman, that's a different conversation entirely." Virgil had reached a position where he could see both fugitives clearly. Buck Morrison crouched behind the wagon wheel, his rifle shaking in his hands, while Mrs. Hartwell pressed herself against the wagon bed, clutching her carpetbag as if it could protect her from the consequences of her choices. For a moment, Virgil had a clear shot at Buck's center mass. One squeeze of the trigger would end the threat permanently, would ensure that the man who had stood by while his daughter was beaten would never threaten anyone again. It would be justice of a sort, swift, final, and personally satisfying. But Sadie Mae's words echoed in his memory. Being better than bad people means acting better than they do. Instead of shooting, Virgil called out once more. "Buck, look around you. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. The only question is whether you surrender now or we drag your body back to town. What's it going to be?" The fight seemed to go out of Buck Morrison all at once. His rifle lowered, and his shoulders sagged with defeat. "Eleanor, I'm sorry. I thought we could—" "It's over, Buck." Mrs. Hartwell's voice was barely a whisper. "It's been over since the moment that child screamed for her father." They emerged from behind the wagon slowly. Hands raised, weapons abandoned. Mrs. Hartwell still clutched her carpetbag, but her face showed the hollow expression of someone who understood that her careful plans had crumbled beyond repair. Sheriff Brennan approached, with his rifle ready, while Pete Garrison and Dave Mueller flanked the prisoners. "Buck Morrison, Eleanor Hartwell, you're under arrest for cattle theft, embezzlement, assault on a minor, and conspiracy to commit fraud." As the sheriff bound their hands with rope, Virgil walked to the wagon and pulled back the canvas cover. Inside, he found not just his strongbox and Mrs. Hartwell's personal belongings, but evidence of a much larger operation, bills of sale for cattle from other ranches, correspondence with buyers in distant cities, and detailed records of thefts dating back almost 2 years. "Sweet Jesus," Dave Mueller breathed, looking over Virgil's shoulder. "This is bigger than we thought." "They've been working the whole territory." Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally broke completely. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We just needed enough money to start over somewhere else. But it kept growing, kept getting more complicated. And my daughter—" Virgil's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. "Where did beating a 10-year-old child fit into your need for a fresh start?" She couldn't meet his eyes. She was asking too many questions, noticing things. "Buck said we needed to keep her scared and quiet until we were ready to leave. So you terrorized a child to protect your theft." Sheriff Brennan's disgust was evident in every word. "That makes this a whole different kind of crime." Buck Morrison finally spoke, his voice hollow with defeat. "I never meant for it to go so far. But that girl, she's got eyes like her mother, sees everything. And you weren't there to protect her, were you, Thorne?" The words were meant to wound, but they bounced off Virgil like rain off stone. "I'm here now. That's what matters." As they prepared to transport the prisoners back to town, Virgil found himself thinking about Sadie Mae's mother's locket, the one she wore with Marie's picture inside. Love had motivated everything, his love for his daughter, Marie's love for both of them, and even the twisted love that had driven Buck and Mrs. Hartwell to crime. But only one kind of love had proven strong enough to survive the test of justice. 3 months later, Cold Rock had settled into a new rhythm, one that acknowledged uncomfortable truths while embracing the possibility of change. The trial of Buck Morrison and Eleanor Hartwell had drawn attention from as far away as Cheyenne, not just for the scope of their crimes, but for what their conviction represented in a territory still learning the difference between frontier justice and civilized law. Both had been sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison, Buck for cattle theft and conspiracy, Mrs. Hartwell for embezzlement and assault. The evidence recovered from their camp had implicated 3 other men in similar schemes across the territory, leading to a series of arrests that had sent a clear message about the consequences of organized theft. But the real change in Cold Rock was subtler, harder to measure in legal terms. It showed itself in the way Mrs. Crawford made a point of greeting Sadie Mae by name when she came to town, in how the pastor had begun including prayers for all the children of our community in his Sunday service, and in the careful respect that most townspeople now showed toward the Thorne family. Not everyone had changed. There were still those who whispered behind their hands, who believed that some people needed to know their place and stay in it. But they whispered more quietly now, and they had learned to keep their opinions away from Virgil Thorne's ears. On this particular morning in late July, Virgil sat on his front porch watching Sadie Mae practice her riding in the corral beside the barn. She had grown noticeably in the months since her ordeal, not just in height, but in confidence and poise. The careful wariness that had marked her movements for weeks after the beating had given way to something stronger, more resilient. Her new tutor, Miss Catherine Reeves, had arrived from Denver 2 weeks earlier, a young woman with impeccable credentials and the kind of quiet strength that reminded Virgil of Marie. She had taken one look at Sadie Mae's composition books and declared that the child was ready for advanced studies that would prepare her for any university in the country. She has her mother's mind, Miss Reeves had told Virgil, and her father's determination. With proper guidance, she could accomplish anything she sets her heart to. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Virgil's attention to the road. Sheriff Brennan was riding up the path, but his relaxed posture suggested a social visit rather than official business. In the months since the trial, Tom Brennan had become a frequent visitor to the Thorne ranch, drawn perhaps by the obvious improvements in how the community had begun treating its most vulnerable members. "Afternoon, Virgil," Brennan called as he dismounted. "That your girl showing off her horsemanship? Teaching that mare some manners is more like it. Sadie Mae's got definite opinions about how a horse should behave." They watched as the 10-year-old guided her horse through a series of turns and stops, her voice carrying clearly across the yard as she praised the animal's efforts. There was joy in the sound, pure, uncomplicated happiness that had been missing for too long. "Got news from the territorial capital," Brennan said, settling into the chair beside Virgil. "Buck Morrison died in prison last week. Viva took him." Virgil absorbed this information without emotion. "And Mrs. Hartwell? Still alive, still serving her sentence. Word is, she's been teaching other prisoners to read and write, trying to make amends in her own way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Sadie Mae work with her horse. The July heat made the air shimmer above the pastures, but the porch remained cool in the shade of the overhanging roof that Marie had insisted on when they built the house. "You know," Brennan said finally, "what happened here changed more than just your family's situation. People in town are talking differently about things, thinking harder about what kind of community they want to build. Change comes slowly," Virgil replied. "But it comes. Your wife would be proud. Marie always believed that love was stronger than hatred, that patience could accomplish what force couldn't." Virgil's hand moved unconsciously to the gold chain around his neck, where her wedding ring rested against his heart. She was right, but it took longer than she expected. Sadie Mae had finished her riding practice and was walking her horse toward the barn. As she passed the porch, she looked up at the 2 men with the bright confidence of a child who knew she was loved and protected. "Papa, Miss Reeves says I'm ready to start Latin next month. She says it will help me understand where English words come from." "Is that what you want to study?" "I want to study everything," Sadie Mae said with the magnificent certainty of youth. "Miss Reeves says knowledge is like a key that opens every door in the world." After she had led her horse into the barn, Sheriff Brennan chuckled softly. That girl's going to take the world by storm someday. She already has, Virgil said. She just doesn't know it yet. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Virgil found himself thinking about the photograph he had commissioned from the traveling photographer who had passed through Cold Rock the previous month. It sat on the mantel in his study now, a formal portrait of himself and Sadie Mae, her small hand resting on his shoulder, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that spoke of unshakable bonds and shared strength. The image had become a symbol of something larger than family. It represented the possibility that love could triumph over prejudice, that justice could prevail over convenience, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns and violence, but with unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Cold Rock was still a frontier town, still rough around the edges and occasionally cruel, but it was also learning to be better. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one child's laughter at a time. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of enemies, but the slow transformation of hearts.